200 kilometers above the Earth, there is no sound. Alexei Leonov floated at the end of a 5.35-meter tether, the first human being to leave the safety of a spacecraft and enter the vacuum of space. For a few minutes, everything worked exactly as planned. Below him, the curve of the Earth rolled past in silence. Above him, a sky darker than any he had seen on the ground. Then his suit began to change shape. It was subtle at first, a tightness in the fingers, a stiffness in the knees. Within minutes, the flexible pressure garment that had fit him precisely on the ground had swollen far beyond its intended dimensions. His gloves no longer reached the ends of his fingers. His boots had pulled away from his feet. The suit that was supposed to keep him alive had inflated like a balloon, and it no longer fit through the door he needed to use to get back inside. Leonov had roughly 45 minutes of oxygen with him. He was orbiting the Earth at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour, and in a matter of minutes, the spacecraft would pass into the darkness of Earth's shadow. He had one option left, and it was not part of the mission plan. This is the story of the world's first spacewalk, and the improvisation that kept it from becoming the world's first death in space. By March of 1965, the Soviet Union had already claimed 2 milestones in the young space race. Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in orbit in 1961. Valentina Tereshkova had become the first woman in space in 1963. The next milestone, leaving the spacecraft entirely, was considered the most dangerous step yet attempted, and Soviet engineers had roughly 9 months to design the hardware that would make it possible. The vehicle assigned to this task was Voskhod 2, a modified version of the earlier Vostok capsule. It carried 2 men, mission commander Pavel Belyaev and pilot Alexei Leonov. To perform the spacewalk, engineers had fitted the spacecraft with something unprecedented, an inflatable external airlock, nicknamed Volga, that could be extended into space, used, and then jettisoned before re-entry. Inside the capsule, cabin pressure was maintained at roughly 1 atmosphere, the same as sea level on Earth. Leonov's spacesuit, designated Berkut, was designed to operate at a much lower internal pressure, approximately 0.4 atmospheres, later reduced further to 0.27, specifically because full atmospheric pressure would make the suit too rigid to bend at the joints. This detail, the deliberate choice to under-pressurize the suit for mobility, would become the center of everything that followed. The plan itself was precise, timed to the second. 90 minutes into the mission, at the end of the first orbit, Belyaev would depressurize the airlock. Leonov would open the outer hatch, move into open space, remain outside for roughly 10 minutes, then return before the spacecraft crossed into orbital night. Soviet television broadcast the moment live. For the watching world, it looked like triumph unfolding exactly on schedule. At 08:34:51 GMT, Leonov left the airlock and became the first human being to float free in space. For the first several minutes, the spacewalk proceeded almost exactly as rehearsed. Leonov moved along his tether, tested his mobility, and radioed back reports of the Earth turning beneath him. But the vacuum of space was doing something to his suit that no ground simulation had fully replicated. On Earth, engineers test spacesuits inside vacuum chambers. But a vacuum chamber cannot perfectly reproduce every condition of orbital spaceflight. The exact interplay of internal suit pressure, the flexing of layered rubberized fabric under zero gravity, and hours of exposure to the thermal extremes of direct sunlight and shadow. In the true vacuum of space, with nothing but 0.4 atmospheres holding back the emptiness around him, Leonov's suit began to expand beyond its design tolerance. The fabric stiffened. The joints that had bent freely in training now resisted every movement. His gloves ballooned until his fingertips no longer reached the ends of them, costing him fine control at the exact moment he needed it most. Then came the second problem, quieter, but just as serious. As Leonov worked to reposition himself for return, he began to sweat heavily inside a suit, with no way to wipe his face, no way to relieve the heat building around him. Perspiration collected inside the helmet. His breathing grew heavier, and his oxygen consumption climbed with it, a slow, compounding drain on a life support supply that had never been generous to begin with. The airlock hatch, designed for a suit at its intended dimensions, was now facing a suit that had grown around it. Leonov moved toward the opening and found that his rigid, swollen form would not pass through in the way the mission had planned. Above him, the orbital clock kept moving. Within minutes, Voskhod 2 would cross into the Earth's shadow, plunging the spacecraft into darkness before his allotted return time expired. This was the moment with no correct procedure written for it. Leonov was alone outside the vehicle, running short on time, wearing a suit that had become a cage. To understand what came next, it helps to understand exactly what a pressurized spacesuit does to the human body, and what happens when that pressure is deliberately reduced. A spacesuit is, in essence, a personal spacecraft. It holds a bubble of breathable gas around a human body that would otherwise be exposed to a vacuum, where boiling point drops far below body temperature, a condition in which unprotected bodily fluids would begin to vaporize within seconds. Every joint in a pressurized suit works against that internal pressure, which is why Soviet engineers deliberately kept the Berkut suit below full atmospheric pressure in the first place. Mobility requires some flexibility, and flexibility requires lower pressure. It is a compromise between protection and function, and on this day, the compromise had swung dangerously toward rigidity. Leonov's solution, arrived at under enormous time pressure and without instruction from mission control, was to further reduce the pressure inside his own suit, bleeding oxygen out through a valve to shrink the suit back toward a size that could pass through the airlock hatch. This was, in the clearest possible terms, a trade. Lowering suit pressure meant regaining mobility. It also meant reducing the very thing keeping his body's fluids from the effects of vacuum, and it meant accepting a heightened risk of decompression sickness, the same condition known to divers as the bends, in which pressure changes cause nitrogen to form bubbles in the bloodstream and tissue. He made the trade, and rather than re-enter through the hatch feet first, following procedure, Leonov chose to go in head first, a decision that let him use his arms, still his most functional limbs, to pull himself through the narrowed opening of the airlock. It was a violation of the checklist, and, by his own later account, the only version of the maneuver that had any chance of working in the time remaining. He forced himself into the airlock, folding his body inside a tunnel barely wide enough to hold him, then had to physically turn himself around inside that confined space to seal the outer hatch behind him, a maneuver never designed to be performed in such a cramped, pressurized suit. By the time the hatch was closed and the airlock began to repressurize, Leonov had spent 12 minutes and 9 seconds outside the spacecraft, and 23 minutes and 41 seconds total exposed to the vacuum environment between opening and closing the airlock. Later accounts described sweat visibly pooling inside his suit by the time he was fully back inside the cabin, a small, human detail that speaks to how physically demanding those final minutes had been. Leonov and Belyaev believed, at the time, that the danger was behind them. It was not. Within hours, the cabin's atmospheric control system began pushing oxygen concentration upward, toward levels that risked combustion from even a minor electrical spark, a separate and unrelated failure that forced the crew through a tense, sleepless night, monitoring the gauges by hand. Then, during re-entry, the automatic guidance system failed, forcing Belyaev to fire the retro-rockets manually. The spacecraft's instrument module failed to separate cleanly from the descent capsule, trailing behind on cables as the two men fell through the atmosphere, until friction finally burned the cables through. They landed roughly 386 kilometers off course, deep in a snow-covered forest in the Ural Mountains, far from any recovery team, where they spent a night surrounded by wolves before rescuers on skis were able to reach them. The spacewalk that made history nearly ended by several independent and unrelated failures in 3 different ways within the span of a single day. Alexei Leonov's 12 minutes outside Voskhod 2 became, for the watching world, a symbol of triumph, the moment humanity proved it could survive, however briefly, entirely outside its home planet. For the engineers who had built the mission, it became something more sobering, a record of exactly how many things a first attempt at something can get wrong, and how much of survival can come down to a single person's improvisation under a countdown they cannot pause. The lessons of Voskhod 2 shaped every spacesuit and airlock designed afterward, in both the Soviet and American space programs. Suit mobility, pressure management, and airlock ingress procedures, the ability to actually get back inside, once outside, became design requirements treated with the same seriousness as life support itself, rather than details worked out after the fact. Only months later, when astronaut Ed White performed the first American spacewalk during Gemini 4, NASA engineers were already studying what had gone wrong aboard Voskhod 2, aware that the vacuum of space rarely forgives an untested assumption. Alexei Leonov returned to Earth having done something no procedure had ever accounted for. He had improvised his way back through a door his own suit no longer fit through, alone, with the orbital clock counting down behind him. It remains one of the clearest illustrations in the history of human spaceflight of a fact engineers have never stopped relearning, that the gap between a plan and reality, in the vacuum of space, is measured in millimeters and in minutes.
What would your thoughts be if you were the first human outside a spacecraft in orbit, inside a malfunctioning suit? I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments below.